Good evening and welcome to the League of Women Voters webinar, a primer on community planning in Montgomery County. I'm Lynna Barnes from LWVMC, the moderator for tonight. For tonight's webinar, we have asked two of the county's planning experts to tell us how planning is done in Montgomery County. How could it be that in a county of 1 million residents coexisting on over 300,000 acres of land, the basic components of daily life, transportation, housing, education, and recreation all seem to be available? But before I introduce the panelists and turn the meeting over to them, let's review some housekeeping details. First, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed. The video recording will be available in the next day or so on our YouTube channel. The web address is in the chat box. Secondly, both speakers will make their presentations. Then we'll provide a question and answer session for participants. Finally, we encourage all of you to ask questions. Click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question into the box, then hit the send or return key. We will answer as many questions as time allows. The program is scheduled to end at 8:30. Our first speaker tonight will be Casey Anderson. Mr. Anderson was reappointed chair of the Montgomery County Planning Board for his second full term in 2019. Mr. Anderson also serves as chair of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which is a bi-county agency that regulates real estate development, plans transportation infrastructure, and manages the park system in Montgomery and Prince George's counties. Over the past 5 years, Casey has championed, among other projects, the redevelopment of aging shopping centers and office parks. He has also done extensive public outreach in working class neighborhoods and, in a kind of local travelogue, visited each of the county's 421 parks. Browsing through what has been written about Mr. Anderson, it is amply documented that his experiences goes beyond the planning board to earlier jobs working as a congressional staffer, a newspaper reporter, a private practice attorney, and a board member of several nonprofits. What isn't so obvious in his bio is that he is the son of two outstanding Montgomery County League of Women Voters members, Dave and Linda Anderson. We consider his presence here tonight a tribute to Dave and Linda. And I have to say that I now edit The Voter, which Linda did for years for the League. And I feel like I'm following in really tough footsteps. Our second speaker tonight will be Pamela Dunn. Ms. Dunn is currently the Senior Legislative Analyst for the County Council. The work she does for the county is grounded in a deep knowledge of Montgomery County planning. Ms. Dunn came to her job with the council from the county planning department, where she participated in a variety of planning activities. At the planning department, she studied ways in which farmers with land in the agricultural reserve could realize some of the value of their land by selling development rights to developers. 2 county programs came into use through the sale of development rights, transferable development rights, and building lot termination. Ms. Dunn works on the TDR and the BLT programs, help protect farmers' interests in the ag reserve. When the League of Women Voters studied the agricultural reserve and eventually took a position to support TDRs and BLTs, Pamela was an informed and helpful resource to the League. Ms. Dunn's work in the planning department also included her leadership in the work to update the 40-year-old county zoning ordinance. She also was instrumental in drafting several editions of the subdivision staging policy. In Pamela's relatively recent transition to the legislative analysis for the county council, she provides a bridge between these two parts of the county government. So it's now my pleasure to invite Mr. Anderson to begin tonight's program.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen and then I will get right into it so we can get to questions as quickly as possible. Can you see my screen? It says Thrive 2050, Framework for Thinking About the Future. I'll take that as a yes. I think Lena's muted, but I'm getting a nod. Okay, so I thought we would talk about a little bit about the general plan and how that fits into the broader planning framework, and use that to illustrate how one specific topic, namely housing, gets translated from a very high level policy discussion and direction down into the ground level of what happens in a specific neighborhood on a specific piece of land. So, oops, I don't know if I can advance this or not. What is the general plan? Thrive 2050 is a comprehensive plan for the county. It establishes a framework for more specific plans. And many of you might be familiar with the Wedges and Corridors Plan, which is the plan that has governed the county's land use since 1964. Thrive 2050 is an update to that plan, and it's currently being drafted, and the planning board just finished work on it. It'll be sent to the county council next month. The general plan directs in, as the name suggests, very general terms how the county should be developed, but it also establishes a long-range direction for the future on all the topics that you would imagine are encompassed within land use, transportation, parks, the way that the physical development of the county happens. So this framework, starting with the general plan at the very high level, if we were 50,000 feet above the surface of the earth in an airplane, then gets translated into more specific plans. Sometimes those are called functional plans because they deal with an area like transportation, for example, or housing in general terms across the county. And sometimes they're an area plan that covers a specific neighborhood or business district like downtown Bethesda, Silver Spring, Germantown, White Oak, Burtonsville, and the like. As you get more detailed in these plans, they start to include some more specific direction about what can happen on specific properties. So, for example, the master plan for the area around Silver Spring, where I live and where Pam lives in North Woodside, specifies what the zoning is supposed to be, and then the county council implements through a separate legal process the zoning that will determine what can be built on your particular piece of property. If you live in a single family house, probably you live in a neighborhood that is zoned predominantly for single family housing. Once the master plan is adopted with its zoning recommendations, then there are sketch plans, which developers, anybody who wants to build something, will submit as part of a development application for a specific parcel, followed by a preliminary plan and ultimately a site plan. And those are just basically terms of art for more specific, detailed drawings and conditions that will outline what happens on a specific piece of property. So you can see this general plan process that we're undertaking right now is the big picture. And that sets the terms of discussion for more specific plans that follow that until ultimately you get to what happens when somebody actually wants to propose that there's a house or an apartment building or an office building or a restaurant or a strip center or whatever a property owner wants to build on their property. So this is the map that is probably the best known image associated with the current general plan, and this outlines where growth is supposed to occur and where it's not supposed to occur. The idea was down in the southern part of the county, mostly inside the Beltway, but even out to Randolph Road, would be the most intensive development. That was called the urban ring back in 1964. And then growth was supposed to proceed out the corridor that's outlined there in pink, which is roughly along the 270 or 355 corridor to Rockville, Gaithersburg, Germantown, and eventually to Clarksburg. And the outlying area in green was supposed to be set aside for rural zoning. There is some housing that's permitted there, but mostly it's supposed to be preserved for farmland. And then you see the yellow and light green wedges, which were the suburban subdivisions that give the plan, the Wedges and Corridors name. So what did that produce in the real world? It didn't just produce a map that outlines physically where is growth supposed to happen and where is it supposed to be limited, but it also identifies problems that the county needs to address. So in 1969, one of the exercises that refined the general plan identified affordable housing as an important problem to be addressed. And that ultimately led the county later to adopt a moderately priced dwelling unit program to make at least 12.5% of all new housing units regulated as to the incomes of the people who could buy them or rent them. The 1969 planning exercise said, gee, we need to be a little bit concerned because we're developing all this farmland. We need to protect the agricultural heritage of the county. And so that led to ultimately to the creation of the Agricultural Reserve and to the Transfer Development Rights Program that Lena was talking a minute ago, that Pam has been involved with in the past. And that 1969 plan also identified the need to coordinate the construction of things like roads and schools and water and sewer infrastructure with growth. And that led to what until recently was called the subdivision staging policy. Now it's called the growth and infrastructure policy that governs what developers have to do to build or pay for public infrastructure before they can construct new buildings. So as we move forward, we have the opportunity with a new general plan to think about what are the challenges that the county has in the future over the coming decades, and how can we set the stage for addressing them, just as the 1964 plan did, with more specific planning exercises and studies, as I described before. So I wanted to talk about one specific area just to give you an illustration of one of the things that we'll be addressing and how that is likely to play out. What you see here is a chart that shows the number of residential dwelling units issued building permits every year since 1994. And what you'll observe is the higher dotted line is the average produced over the last, since 1998. And then the lower dotted line is the average produced since the economic recession of 2008 and 2009. And what you see there is that we've had a long-term decline in the number of housing units that are getting built every year. I know a lot of people think that's contrary to their lived experience. They say, oh, I see these construction cranes in downtown Silver Spring and Bethesda and White Flint and other places. It seems like there's a lot of growth going on. And I think that's largely because most of the growth is now focused in the places that are already developed. So it's much more visible. There are no more farms out in Clarksburg really to subdivide and create new subdivisions. So people don't, I think, perceive that there's a lot of development going on. I think it's just that it's more visible because it's more about redevelopment and infill than it is about the greenfield development that's happened in the past. In any case, what you see here is that over the last 10 years, we really have not produced anywhere near the number of housing units that we used to, even though we continue to produce jobs. We'd like to produce more jobs. There has been weak wage growth, but there has been wage growth. And yet our housing production is in long-term decline and has been anemic. It's not sufficient to keep up with demand. And what you see there to the right is a comparison in the red to the number of housing units we'll be producing if we kept on the average of the last 10 years versus the green bar above that, how many more we'd need to match supply and demand, according to the Council of Governments' recent study on housing needs for the DC region. So we probably need to be building about 4,000 units a year. I would argue maybe even closer to 5,000 units a year just to catch up for some of the slow housing production that we've had over the past decade or so. But in any event, it needs to be a lot more than it has been recently, which is somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000 units, even in good years, and sometimes well below that. At the same time, we have to recognize that unlike 1964, we've built out a lot of the county and it's been developed. This is a map that shows all of the physical, environmental, legal constraints on development. And where you see the white areas that are not filled in with gray or black are the areas that are theoretically available for some additional development. And I won't go through all the details of this, but the point is that this Swiss cheese map, I think, illustrates that we have quite a lot of constraints. We don't have a lot of farmland that we can subdivide to meet our need for housing. And even if we did, we probably wouldn't want to do that. So we have an issue with constraints on our ability to develop, but we still have a need to provide housing for our workforce and to provide the quality of life that people want to have over the coming decades. I think most people would agree that affordable housing is an issue of social justice, but it's also an economic development issue. This chart shows the difference in the cost of living between Austin, Texas, Raleigh, North Carolina, Pittsburgh, and Montgomery County. I picked those jurisdictions because we sometimes consider those to be competing parts of the country that are competing for some of the life sciences and technology jobs that we hope to attract. And what you see from this is not only is our cost of living higher than those places, but almost all of the difference in the cost of living between Montgomery County and the DC region and those other parts of the country is attributable to the high cost of housing. So if we don't have housing that's not only affordable to poor or lower middle income people, but also to even relatively affluent people can't find a place to live that they find satisfactory, that becomes a problem when we're trying to attract employers, and in turn for those employers to attract and retain the employees that they need to do business and support our tax base. So it's both a social justice issue and it's also an economic development issue. This table is really what illustrates probably the most interesting thing I've learned in the last 2 years. So if you remember nothing else about this presentation, I'd urge you to think about this and remember it. What this shows is the change in household formation, household sizes and types that Montgomery County has experienced since 1960. And we see over there on the left bar, it shows that in 1960, 60% of households consisted of a married couple with children under the age of 18 living at home. And only 7% of households consisted of one person living by themselves. If you move forward through time to 2018, you see that those proportions are basically turned on their head. You have about only 26% of households consist of a married couple with kids at home, and 25% of households consisted of one person living by themselves. So there's a dramatic difference in the kind and size of households that we have in the county. And yet, even as households are getting smaller, houses are getting bigger. This chart shows that the average square footage of a new home built in Montgomery County in the 50s was a little over 1,500 square feet, whereas in the last couple decades, it's been over 3,500 square feet. So houses are getting dramatically bigger. A lot more households are getting dramatically smaller. And many, especially as baby boomers age out of the workforce, have more empty nesters at home living in big houses. We have many households that have a lot more bedrooms than people living in them. Now, of course, some people want to live in a big house, even though they don't have many people, because they want a spare bedroom for when the kids come home, or they want a home office. But I think that you get the idea that we have something of a mismatch between the housing types that we have available, the housing stock, and the kind of households who want a place to live. And you might ask how we got in that situation. Well, the general plan of 1964 says, among other things, that single-family detached neighborhoods should be protected from any other kind of development. And so over a third of the county is zoned for single-family housing. Now, I'm not going to say that every square inch of that land includes only single-family housing, because there's a variety of exceptions that have been incorporated in the zoning code, and various decisions have been made over time to accommodate things like townhouses in some places. But the basic idea has been retained that we should set aside huge areas of land in the county to keep single-family zoning and single-family zoning only. And we see down there in the bottom right, the percentage of the county's land area it's zoned for multifamily housing is about 2.3%. There's a little bit more for other mixed use development that could include apartment buildings, but you get the idea. A very small area of land that can accommodate something other than single family detached houses. So the general plan gives us an opportunity to try to set the stage for doing something about it. And among the recommendations the planning board is making in the new draft of the general plan we're sending to the county council on housing is that we need more of it. We need to try to make it more affordable. We need different kinds of housing and sizes and types of housing, not just more of it and not just that it should be less expensive, but it needs to meet a wider variety of kinds of people's lifestyles. And we need to do that in more places. So how does that get translated into the real world? Well, some of you may have heard the term missing middle, which is kind of planning speak for everything between single family houses and high-rise apartment buildings. So it could include duplexes and triplexes and 2-over-2s and townhouses and even small apartment buildings. But one of the ideas about this plan is, just as the 1964 plan and the 1969 refinement identified the need to preserve land for agriculture, create an adequate public facilities ordinance, deal with some of the issues with affordable housing. This plan will call on the county to recognize that we really need to have more flexibility in our zoning code, and we need to allow neighborhoods to evolve to meet the needs of the future. And that will translate into area plans incorporating hopefully more different kinds of housing, area master plans. It will include probably a zoning text amendment at some point later this year to accommodate some of these other kinds of housing, and ultimately will result in development applications, as I said at the beginning, where developers, property owners will come to the planning board and submit applications to approve the construction of these different kinds of housing. So I go through all this, because I couldn't resist the urge to give you a little advertisement for what we're doing in the general plan, but also because I think it illustrates one strand that's very specific, namely housing and the need to provide a different kind of housing and more housing, and how that plays out in the general plan. And ultimately we'll work its way through more specific planning exercises to bring new kinds of housing into the real world as it gets constructed. And with that, I will turn it back over to Pam and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Casey. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Dunn to give her presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I have a slideshow as well, although not nearly as interesting to look at as Mr. Anderson's. Mine's a little dull, but it provides the points at which I'm going to be speaking to, which is the council's role in land use planning. So I'm going to pull that up for you. And so for tonight, my goal is to just walk you through sort of, you've listened to Chair Anderson. He's told you that the planning department creates plans and provides many recommendations in these plans, not just for zoning and for housing, but for parks, open space, multiple things. There's a variety of things that do come out of the planning department, and they come to the county council, and the county council is usually then the decider on what happens next. So I kind of grouped it into three things. The county council and land use planning, they are the land use and zoning authority for the region. They have the power to change zoning on property in the county. They're the only body other than the municipalities that also have their own zoning authority. We have a handful of municipalities that do have that, the city of Rockville, the city of Gaithersburg, and some of the smaller ones as well. The council also influences land use planning through the capital improvements program, right? So large transportation projects, parks, public facilities, those are funded through the capital improvement program, and they have an impact on our life. When a new recreation center is able to get built because the county funds it, when a new park is able to be acquired because the council supports the recommended budget for that, these things also change our land use. And then last, as Chair Anderson also mentioned, is the growth and infrastructure policy. It has in the past been called the subdivision staging policy. and before that was commonly known as the growth policy. This document is about timing development with infrastructure, and because of that, it has an influence on land use and when we see things happen. So breaking down the first one, the Land Use and Zoning Authority, this primarily happens through the master planning process. And as many of you are probably aware, the planning department has a number of ongoing master plans every year. And in these master plans are recommendations on land use and zoning. The plan itself gets adopted, and these recommendations then are in text and approved by the council. And also what you have is what's called a sectional map amendment. It accompanies that master plan. It usually comes right after it. And it is the document that places the zoning that has been recommended and approved through the master plan on the zoning map. It changes zoning in the county under an umbrella of looking at the master plan. Zoning can also change when an individual property owner says, I own this property, but I'd really like to see if I can do something else with it. The zoning code has a handful of zones that we call floating zones. They exist, they kind of float around until somebody says, I want to apply for it. And if the council approves it, I'm putting it down on my piece of land. And those floating zones can be for residential detached houses, townhouses, multifamily housing. They can be commercial mixed use zones. They can be employment zones. We have them in the code for all sorts of things. And I would think we only have one or two of those floating zones approved in any 1 year. And I'll explain more of that in a minute. And then the third way this zoning authority is really handled by the council and has an influence is through zoning text amendments. And that means changing the zoning code itself, what it allows. So I have more on that. So in the master planning process, the planning board, as I was saying, it creates a draft. It has recommendations for an area in the county, the Silver Spring Downtown Plan, the Bethesda Plan, Burtonsville. When it comes out with their recommendations, they transmit that to the county council. The council holds a public hearing on the planning board's recommendations on zoning and land use that's in that plan. Following that, the public hearing, they'll hold work sessions with the Planning, Housing, and Economic Development Committee. It can be anywhere from one work session to, I don't know, a lot. I think the Downtown Bethesda Plan had more than 10, but typically it's 2 or 3 that are with the Planning and Housing and Economic Development Committee. Then once they make their decisions on each of those recommendations in the plan goes to the full council with the recommendations of the committee. Committee has either 1 or 2 work sessions, or sorry, the council has 1 or 2 work sessions as well, and then usually has an adoption of the plan, making some changes from the planning board draft. And this is important. So this doesn't change the plan itself doesn't change the zoning. It recommends the zoning change. What I mentioned earlier was a sectional map amendment that actually changes the zoning. But what the master plan does, though, is it does set up these recommendations as something that the planning board follows. So when a development application comes in, as Chair Anderson was saying, a preliminary plan for subdivision comes in, one of the required findings of the board is that the application for that subdivision substantially conforms to recommendations in the master plan. So if the master plan has recommendations regarding the amount of open space on a piece of property, or how something should be sited on a piece of property, or how it should be accessible to the public, a variety of different things in the master plan, planning staff is aware of it and they brief the board on it, and the board ensures that that applicant abides by those recommendations that are in the master plan. But with that is also, like I said, the zoning changes too, and those come through on what's called a sectional map amendment. It's a resolution that literally just changes the zoning on the zoning map, the official zoning map in the county. Occasionally, what you'll hear when you hear about a master plan is that it's also recommending something called an overlay zone. And the overlay zone is like another zone on top of all of the zones in the master plan area, or wherever it's specified in the plan area. And it doesn't go down by sectional map amendment, which is a little odd because that's how we said all the zoning gets implemented. But it actually does change text in the zoning code. So it gets implemented through a zoning text amendment. As I mentioned earlier, the other place that the council has land use authority and zoning is through this local map amendment. Property owner says, I want to change my own zoning. They provide an application to the planning department. The planning department staff review it. They make a recommendation to the planning board. The planning board makes a review and recommendation to the hearing examiner. Hearing examiner holds a public hearing. And then they send a report to the county council. And again, as I said, the council is the final authority if you're not in a municipality on zoning. And so they will either approve or deny that request for rezoning on a particular property. And then again, there are the zoning text amendments, which I think people are usually quite aware of. We've had some in the county recently. They are very, they generate a lot of conversation. One recently has been the one on accessory dwelling units. That was a big one, right? Should people be allowed by right to request an accessory dwelling unit on their property? That's a change to the zoning code. Farm alcohol production was another one. 10 years ago, it was not easy for somebody that wanted to do a brewery or a winery in the county to really operate. And so those things come to light. Usually somebody in an industry or somebody in a situation will contact planning staff to talk to them about it. And we'll also contact some council members to see if they can get interest in making a change to whatever is holding them back from being able to do something they think is beneficial to the well-being of the county. And then it gets evaluated. So you'll see it going through the planning department. They evaluate it from a planning perspective. Then it comes to council. Again, it goes through the Fed, the housing, the Planning, Housing, Economic Development Committee, and eventually gets to the full council who votes on it because they make all zoning changes. So not only can you change uses in the zoning code, you can change how things are developed. So we think of the zoning in two ways if people aren't familiar with it. Zoning is what can be built or what can happen on a piece of property. And then it's how is it built or how is it constructed on a piece of property. Those are the primary things that zoning does. And text amendments can change those things. As I mentioned, the capital improvements program, for anyone that's not familiar with it, a biennial process. It basically programs funding for capital projects for 6 years. We talk about a full CIP year. Those are even numbered years, in which case every capital project in the county is evaluated over that 6-year horizon. And the horizon's moved out by 2 years. In an off year, which is this year, because it's an odd numbered year, we call that an amendment year. And basically the council focuses on proposed changes, like the changing of a scope of a project. Maybe it has grown, the need for it has grown in the last year, or possibly they've reduced the scope because financial reasons. And it can change the timing of projects. And we know that we have projects for parks, for transportation infrastructure, and a lot of our public facilities. And then last is the growth and infrastructure policy. This is a quadrennial policy document. It's really about the timing, as I said, of development and the capacity for public facilities. It has always really focused on whether transportation and schools are adequate. It is really the rules for assessing the impact of new development on transportation and school facilities. And a lot of times you will hear talk of impact taxes when people talk about what is now going to be called the growth and infrastructure policy. They really are two separate policy documents, and the impact tax regulations don't necessarily have to be tied at all to the APFO or growth and infrastructure policy, but they're very similar and they do similar things. And so you a lot of times hear them tied together. I want to just talk for a little bit about kind of what in general is going on at the council related to some of these issues. For master plans right now, the council has been reviewing the Shady Grove sector minor master plan amendment. It actually goes to the council tomorrow for a work session. Ashton Village sector plan has had its public hearing and it will start to be reviewed by the Fed committee in April. And then as Chair Anderson mentioned, Thrive Montgomery 2050 is the general plan update, and it's due to come to council in April. Because it is such a large endeavor and covers the entire county as far as this very prominent policy document, it will probably take a different kind of review, more of a ramped up review than just a traditional master plan would. And so there may be multiple briefings on it before we hold a public hearing. There may be more than one public hearing on it just to make sure everyone has a chance to speak. And then what we will probably do is have multiple analysts on council staff review it, not just me with land use planning, but Linda McMillan, who's the analyst on housing, will look at it. Gene Smith, who is the analyst on economic development. Dr. Orland, who does transportation. We will probably do a group effort to really evaluate and analyze the recommendations in the general plan, Thrive Montgomery. And just in general, from what I take, having been at council for 2 years, the focus has been, as council members have been looking at these master plans, what have they been sort of the policy issues they've been the most interested in and pursuing or pushing, and some of those as Chair Anderson has already been said, they really focus on housing production and preservation, affordable housing in particular, and on county-owned land. That is something that in each master plan they look at. Is there county-owned land in this master planned area? And what are we saying about affordable housing related to that county-owned property? And then again, there's always a section, and it takes prevalence because we know we need parks and open space as we continue to grow as a county and become more populated. The parks and open space become even more important for people's quality of life and well-being. And then again, transit, pedestrian and bike infrastructure and Vision Zero have also risen higher to the top as things that the council considers when looking at these master plans and the recommendations. One piece of this that is interesting, because people may not have known this piece, the semi-annual report is something that is given by the park and the planning departments twice a year. They give a semi-annual report to the council in the fall. They just update the council on their work program. They give a second semi-annual report in the spring. Actually, theirs is going to be April 6th. And it basically is a discussion with the council about what their upcoming work program should be, what master plans should be on their list for the coming years. And that's sort of where the council has that conversation and sets some of those things. It's part of the budgeting process. When you talk about an operating budget, the council's also saying to the planning department, okay, and here's what you will work on. Some other issues before the council related to zoning text amendments, if anyone's been following it, kind of hard to miss it, has been solar facilities in the agricultural reserve zone that has been passed in a very limited fashion. Solar facilities that can produce what is called community solar will be allowed in the AR zone. Currently still under review. We've had a couple Fed committee work sessions, may soon go to the full council, is small cell antennas or 5G, how those are allowed in residential zones. And we've had multiple ZTAs introduced, but two others that are kind of sitting there. They may not go before the council for a while because we are now in the midst of budget. One is related to R60 zoning, use and standards. That's really missing middle housing, the one that Chair Anderson mentioned. And then there's also one out there for residential care facilities, really about allowing multiple building types for residential care. So because currently our code is antiquated with this use and really directs that housing under this use would be multifamily housing. And yet we could all imagine that residential care facilities could provide townhouses or even small cottage houses and still provide care in a separate building. So that's sort of what that ZTA entails. And the capital improvements program, again, this is the off year, so we're just doing adjustments, but there are many things that's on the list for the council to look at that came over from the county executive. One of the new things, even though we typically don't see that many new things in an off year, is a full upgrade to the recycling center. There's a supplemental appropriation for a homeless shelter, scope changes for ride-on, and then schedule adjustments for the Capitol Crescent Trail. So you can see how, some of these have more land use implications than others, but capital programming typically does. It means something will be built or constructed somewhere. And then last, planning issues related to the growth and infrastructure policy. It was renamed in November when the most recent policy was adopted. Again, like I said, it's a 4-year document. They're not going to do this again until November of 2024. They'll adopt the next one. But this one removed the moratorium on residential development related to school capacity. No longer will there be a moratorium, but you will pay a higher and higher what is called a utilization premium payment. You will pay a certain premium when schools are a certain amount overcrowded, and as they become more and more over capacity, if development wants to move forward, it will be required to pay more and more as a premium payment to do that, and that money will go to the school system. There's been greater attention to PED, bike, and Vision Zero facilities and rules related to that in this infrastructure and growth policy. And then again, there were some impact tax changes as well. So it's kind of the high level view of how some of the stuff that once it comes from planning gets implemented by the council, and kind of what they're working on, but I'm happy to also answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Pam. Actually, it's interesting because I was writing notes and some of the things I had as notes to ask questions about, you answered as you went along. So I really appreciate that because now it is time to move to our question and answer period. So we will try to get as many of them as we can in the time that remains. The questions will be read and presented to the speakers by our Q&A manager, Amelia Brust. And so I'm going to turn it over to her now, and I'll just tell you the first question is mine, and you've you both talked about it a little bit, but I'd like to hear more on that. So let's go to Amelia.
Thanks, Lena. Yes, if you have a question for our presenters, please put them in the Q&A box. You can find the button for the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question, and then you hit return or send. As Lena said, our first question is hers, but I think it's a substantial question to start with. So in the past year, 2 high-profile zoning changes have been proposed by the county council members via zoning text amendments, and we have talked about them so far tonight. One was to add solar panels in the agricultural reserve, which did recently pass the council, albeit with several changes to the proposed ZTA. The other proposed planning change was to add missing middle housing in areas close to transit hubs. And that is under consideration right now, at the same time that the planning department is extensively studying the issue for this type of housing. So the question is, what role do you think the planning department should have in these proposals from county council members, which seem to be outside of the detailed process that the planning department typically uses?
Well, the council on the missing middle ZTA that Councilmember Juwando introduced, the council's Fed committee recently sent us a letter asking the planning board and the planning department to the Juwando proposal along with other ideas about missing middle and prepare a ZTA or other proposal for their consideration, which would probably wind up delivering sometime late this year. I would guess the fall probably is realistically the earliest we would do that. And that, I should say, is pretty routine whenever, this is always a two-way process. The planning department or the planning board sometimes initiate proposals for changes in land use policy. Sometimes the council initiates it. And it's obviously we take ideas from various stakeholders. Sometimes it's property owners, sometimes it's people in the real estate business, sometimes it's civic leaders. We get ideas from various people, stakeholders, and often we'll get the ball rolling with an idea by asking the council to introduce a zoning text amendment or ask us to do a study. Or conversely, on their own initiative, the county council will say, we want you to study missing middle, or we want you to study solar in the ag reserve. We want you to study, what's the best way to think about the future of transit in the I-270 corridor, whatever the case may be. And we'll take that up because, as you know, Pam used to be one of our staff people who worked in countywide planning, and we have a much larger staff than the county council does. We're effectively staffing the county council. They have their own professional staff, but it's relatively small. We often will take on some of these issues that require, many months of analysis, lots of expert work to be done, and we'll produce that analysis, chew on it, make a recommendation, and then send that to the council for their consideration. As Pam said, the council is the one that ultimately decides on these policy issues, but it's quite routine for the council to ask us or for us to propose initiating new ideas and work it through the process.
Thank you. Kind of another question though on the planning process itself. At what point does the average citizen have the most influence to affect what gets built in the county and where?
That depends on what you're interested in. I would say that if what you're talking about is somebody wants to build a house across the street from where you live, then the best opportunity to weigh in on that is usually going to be at the planning board when we hold a hearing on a development application, or in some cases, a hearing examiner. if what you're interested in is a little bit bigger question about what's going on, in your general part of the county or the entire county, then there are a lot of opportunities to weigh in on that, both with the planning department, planning board, and then later at the county council when they take it up and make the decision about adopting a master plan and the zoning that comes along with that. Did you want to add to that, Pam?
Yeah. So what I would say is kind of two tiers, very similar to what Chair Anderson said. I would say that the most important step, though, first off, if you are concerned with what could happen in your community and there's an area master plan going on, you would speak up at that, because if in fact the planning board is changing the zoning in your community, you want to be proactive in that. You may very much support those changes. You may be looking forward to saying, great, let's have some mixed use development down the street that I can walk to and I don't have to take my car everywhere. So it doesn't have to be you just want to be involved because you don't want things to happen. It can be you want to be involved because you do want them to happen. But you'd be involved in the master planning, because if the zoning gets changed, the zoning is what really determines the ultimate amount of what can happen, the potential, I will say, what can happen on a piece of property. And then the second level to that is also what Chair Anderson had said, is then when the development application comes in, so the zoning gets changed, or maybe it's not even up for grabs, so that's kind of like not the point. But when the development application then for a piece of property comes in, your other opportunity is to go to the planning board to talk about what you as a stakeholder, resident, community member think about that development application. Now, a development application, you only have certain things that you can probably comment on, right? Their zoning will allow them to, file the application that they file necessarily. They won't be asking for anything that they can't have under the zoning. You can then comment on the details under which it gets approved. So that's like the two different levels. You can have input onto what the ultimate zoning is, so what they have the potential to do. And then once they have that zoning, you can comment on what are the details of the application for that actual development.
Great, thank you. So how does the planning committee or planning department reach out to historically underserved communities to get their input on how to improve their access to public services, and how potential plans or zoning changes could affect their neighborhoods or could affect their access to public services?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
How does the planning department or the planning committee reach out to historically underserved communities or communities that have not historically been as tapped in to county government operations to get their input on how future plans could affect them?
Well, I would say that technology has allowed us to use a lot more, to find much more cost-effective ways to reach out more broadly. And we are, for example, we had some success when we were doing a plan on the Veers Mill corridor at reaching out to Spanish speakers, not only by putting up ads on street furniture and bus shelters saying in Spanish, saying we're doing a plan, but providing a link so people could text us their ideas about the plan if they walk past and they see an advertisement on the side of a bus shelter, for example. So it's not only a question of that it was in a different language, but we are also giving anybody with a cell phone has the ability to communicate with us. They don't even have to wait until they get back home in order to provide some input. And what we found is that, contrary to what some people think, actually cell phones, pretty much everybody has a cell phone these days, even people relatively low income, people who are newer immigrants, that cell phones are pretty much ubiquitous. Not everybody has an iPhone 11, but they have at least a cell phone that they can have some kind of data connection with. So we found that we've had some more, that's just one of many examples of how we've gotten away from relying, I think, on the past, much more on let's put out a notice to the neighborhood listservs. And then you wouldn't necessarily even hear about that if you weren't part of a local civic association, which is typically people who own their own houses, who lived in a neighborhood for a long time, and access to some of those channels of information is limited to people who are members. So we've adopted quite a few different strategies to try to reach people in different ways. I think that it depends on what the planning exercise is in terms of like which tactics we're using, and we're always experimenting with new ways and seeing what gets a response.
Great, thank you. The next question: how does the planning process reconcile the need for increased housing in the county with the population distribution in schools, and ensure as much as possible that an increase in new housing does not exacerbate overcrowding in the county schools?
Well, maybe Pam would like to talk a little bit about this last growth policy, but I think the short answer is that there's a consensus that I think has emerged among elected officials, and also I think those of us who work as appointed or career people in planning, that the old policy, which tried to stop development until schools were built, was not really succeeding in getting schools built, and it was also causing major problems with the orderly and effective delivery of the housing that the county needs. So I think there's been a shift away from the idea that we should impose a moratorium if there's not a school available, and toward requiring payments for developers to pay at least their share of the capital cost of new school seats as the primary way that developers are expected to respond to the need to create more school infrastructure. But maybe Pam wants to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. I can see there's lots of questions, so I won't belabor it. But the idea is that the impact tax is set at 100% of the cost of a student seat. So each developer, for every unit that they build, is paying for what has been calculated to be their impact on the capital cost of school infrastructure related to that unit. But if you're in an area that's even more crowded, as I said, not only are you paying that impact tax, but you're going to pay some proportion on top of it as a quote premium, so that you're paying even more than like the school facility that your unit is going to need, your development is going to need, with the hope that by paying even more than is required to actually build it, you can help effectuate getting it built either faster, or it gets into the CIP or things like that. What Chair Anderson was saying is that there were inefficiencies before with the moratorium. To avoid the moratoriums, certain school clusters were getting more attention for the facilities they needed than other ones because there was the moratorium, which you could also think of was going to be in places that was more desirable to build, or in parts of the county that were leaving other parts of the county unattended. There's only so many capital dollars to go around. So I think this idea that you can just get even more money for the capital that you need to build schools across the whole county has been what the result of the last policy change.
Great, thank you. Our next question: how do we get into situations such as on Rockville Pike and Bethesda, or White Flint and Pike and Rose areas, where a lot of buildings are being constructed very quickly, so much so that it outpaces infrastructure changes made to address increased traffic around those areas? Is that something that is part of the planning process, or is that something that kind of happens outside of like a master plan sort of purview?
Yeah, the master plan process does look at the transportation impact of new development. I think that the council and the planning board have come to the view that in many cases, and Rockville Pike's a good example. Route 29 is another one. There's predominantly through traffic that will exist whether or not new development happens. And so limiting the amount of development that can happen in White Oak, for example, or White Flint will really not do anything to limit traffic congestion on Rockville Pike or Route 29, as the case may be, because in the case of Route 29, you've got traffic from people in Columbia, people in Howard County, people in Burtonsville, from points north trying to get south towards Silver Spring and DC, or in the case of 355, people coming from anywhere between Frederick County to Clarksburg to Germantown to Gaithersburg to Rockville, traveling through that area. And so the idea that I think was reflected in some of the policies that the counties had in the past, which is, well, there's traffic congestion on Rockville Pike, so let's stop development. I think the realization has come that that wasn't helpful to solving traffic congestion, and it also had a pretty serious impact on the county's economic development potential, and for that matter, even in some ways incentivized pushing development further out and making the traffic worse. So I think, so the short answer is yes, that is considered and analyzed as part of the planning process, but I think that there's probably no entirely satisfactory answer to everyone for how can you limit traffic congestion. That's a problem that I think we struggle with, as does probably every other jurisdiction in the country that is attracting jobs and people.
Thank you. And when it comes to congestion, I think that is a perfect segue to our next question. Your initial map showed the I-270 expansion as a way to reduce congestion, but some neighborhoods, such as in Rockville, could be negatively affected. And it seems that the governor's plan for 270 is not quite on par with what Montgomery County envisioned. Montgomery County Council and Rockville Council opposed the expansion. What are your thoughts about potential effects of the I-270 expansion on the county's master plan?
The county has plans which call for some limited widening of I-270 and of the Beltway between the American Legion Bridge and the I-270 split. And while I have my own views, which it's part of my job to advise the county council as to what the planning board and the planning department think about proposals like the Managed Lanes project. But I think everybody needs to recognize that there are existing transportation plans which have been approved over a period of decades, which do call for some limited widening of those roads. So notwithstanding what I think about it, that I think you need to be, everybody just needs to keep in mind that there are long-standing planning policies that in some ways favor some of these projects, not entirely, but to some limited degree. Personally, I think, part of the problem is what I mentioned a minute ago about traffic congestion in White Flint, is that if you make it easier to drive from Frederick to Washington, D.C., you'll get more people that decide they'd rather buy a cheap house in Frederick and drive to Washington, D.C., or as opposed to a more expensive house in Rockville or Bethesda or White Flint, and therefore you'll get more, ultimately, that's a phenomenon known as induced demand. If you make it easier to drive longer distances by speeding up traffic, you'll get more people that jump on the road, and then you'll have more traffic congestion and people driving longer distances. And that's one of the reasons that I'm personally not very enthusiastic about that project. But I speak only for myself on that.
Noted, thank you. So then our next question is, how closely is county planning and the Thrive Plan in particular tied with climate concerns and the development of Montgomery County's climate action plan? Does the Thrive Plan explicitly address climate change?
The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is that it addresses it by incorporating land use recommendations and transportation recommendations, which are really the wheelhouse of planning. It addresses in a limited way things like energy efficiency of buildings, because that's kind of at the edge of where our authority ends and other agencies and parts of the government begin. But we're covering climate in terms of land use and transportation, I think is the best way I can put it. And fortunately, that the things that we can do in land use to be more environmentally sustainable in general and reduce climate impact of development in particular are also things that will help our economic competitiveness and in some ways make our county more socioeconomically and racially equitable, namely creating an opportunity for a wider variety of housing types in more places to encourage infill and redevelopment instead of sprawl, to encourage more reliance on transit, biking and walking as opposed to driving. Those things are all good for the climate, and they're also helpful to achieve other economic and social justice objectives.
Great, thank you. Our next question is about the bike master plan and the new pedestrian master plan, which have many very interesting components, but the old infrastructure that has been implemented over the years can make retrofitting the old with the new very difficult. So are there specific ways that implementation of new bike and pedestrian infrastructure plans can be promoted?
Redevelopment is the currency that pays for a lot of improvements in public infrastructure, including bike and pedestrian infrastructure. So when a developer wants to build a new apartment building in downtown Bethesda or Silver Spring, we're typically asking them to make the associated bike and pedestrian improvements while they're doing that, along the roadway in front of their project. And as Pam had said in her beginning of her presentation, that's sort of supplemented by the CIP. The county's capital budget pays for a limited amount of those kinds of improvements, but we don't have a lot of money to go around. There's a lot more, not just bike and pedestrian infrastructure, but other needs that the county has with a very limited number of dollars to spread around. So I think it's a combination of some public money, but also working to try to take advantage of redevelopment to finance and incorporate some of that into new real estate projects.
Great, thank you. Wow, we've got a lot of great questions here, so everyone feel free to keep them coming. So the next question is, what will the county do to start addressing the growing number of seniors who maybe perhaps want to downsize, but do not need entirely assisted living or long-term care, yet downsizing to just a smaller one-level home in the county has become too expensive for them? What is the planning committee's outlook for this group of the population?
Well, if I'd given a longer presentation, I would have talked about how missing middle fits into not just, part of that discussion we had at the beginning about changing household types. One of the reasons we have a lot more 1- and 2-person households is because people are living longer. And so it's some of it's younger people are not coupling up as early as they did, and some not at all. Some are choosing to delay childbearing. Some are deciding not to have children at all. But then at the other end of the life cycle, there's people who are living longer. Perhaps their children have left, maybe they're widowed, and they're living in big houses, and they're looking for a way to downsize. Maybe they don't want to live in downtown Bethesda or in a really urban place like DC, but they're looking for other options. And that's one of the reasons why missing middle is important, to create a wider range of choices. Pam, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that what you were saying, the missing middle idea is that it's about how do you look at a piece of land and allow for just some slightly smaller units on it. It's not about big, dense development. The optimal density for missing middle is 15 units per acre. If we think of our traditional R60 neighborhood, that's about 7 units per acre. So it's really only like a little more than double. Think of a house and an accessory dwelling unit. I mean, it's that intensity in general. It's not very, very intense, but it allows for the ability to do more different types of building types, meaning small cottage housing, which doesn't have to be in an assisted living community. Getting at your question, that people might want just a different housing type, but don't want to have to move into Riderwood or another assisted living facility. They just want something smaller. So how does the county, and it sounds like Thrive 2050 is really looking at that issue. We have a changed demographic in our county. What do we do with what this county is going to need in the next 20, 30 years moving forward? And the other thing I'll mention is, I'd mentioned the one ZTA on the continuing care retirement community that was really motivated by the idea that a continuing care retirement community also shouldn't just be one housing type. It shouldn't just be a multifamily building with care on the bottom floor. We have other uses in the code, similar senior housing, senior and independent living is another. They need to be modernized and looked at for these different housing types.
Great, thank you. Our next question, has there been any discussion about how to turn perhaps unused malls, big stores, or other vacant commercial space into housing facilities, especially affordable housing?
Yes, Westfield, who owns both Montgomery Mall and Wheaton Mall, has reached, well, they're sort of at different stages of the process. Westfield Montgomery has a development application that's approved that allows them to put housing on that site. The Wheaton Mall, I know they've looked at that and would like to do something similar, but I think the market is not quite there yet for housing, and they also have some issues with some of the infrastructure WMATA has at the metro station, kind of getting in the way with drive access to that site to allow the edge of the mall property in Wheaton to redevelop. I know also, I don't follow Gaithersburg land use quite as closely because we don't get in their business, but I know Lake Forest Mall also has a buyer who has a proposal for some redevelopment. So I think there's a lot of interest in trying to figure out how to reposition some of these malls that are, especially ones that are losing big anchor tenants, and trying to adapt them probably with some more housing, but also to figure out how to repurpose some of those spaces for even different retail type uses. And of course, we're also looking at office parks with things like Rock Spring, where the old Marriott headquarters was bought by an assisted living company. They're going to redevelop that site to be a basically long-term care type of facility, or assisted living, something like that. And at Tower Oaks, EYA, big townhouse developers, putting more townhouses there, and that apparently is selling briskly. People want to live in the Wootton cluster, or in the case of Rock Spring, they can live in the WJ cluster. And so townhouses are not a hard product to sell in those kind of environments. And we think that that's generally positive, because some of this grade B and C office space is kind of tough to lease at this point. And that allows some of these office parks to kind of reposition themselves and transform and get a new lease on life.
Great, thank you. So earlier in the presentation, there was mention of the impact tax. How large is the impact tax, or how is it tabulated? And could it affect the price of a home so much so that it could make housing no longer affordable, or reasonably attainable.
Pam?
So I can tell you how it is calculated, which is we know how much, the planning staff is in contact with MCPS, and they get all the student data, 100% of it. And they know it by address and by grade level. So we don't have personal information, but we know that. Because we know that, the planning staff can figure out what type of structure each one of those students is coming from. So what they calculate is something called a student generation rate. And it is on average the rate of how many elementary, middle, high school, or public school students are coming from, say, a single family detached house, or a townhouse, or a garden apartment, or a high rise. That's how they do it. And if you know on average how many students are coming from each one of those structures, you can also get the information from MCPS on how much does it cost to build, the capital cost of building a student seat for each school level. So you combine those two. You say by housing type. So for a single family detached house, it's X number of elementary students times this cost. It's Y number of middle school times this cost, and Z number of high schoolers times this cost. I now know the capital cost of what it will be if a new single family detached house is built, what it's going to cost MCPS to build a structure to help, to educate those students. And that's what the impact tax is set at, 100% of that cost. So if a developer says I'm going to build, 30 single family detached houses, they're paying that 100% student seat cost for the 30 houses that they build. I don't remember the other part of the question.
It was, could these impact taxes potentially take housing from affordable and attainable to no longer affordable or attainable?
I guess, on the margins, it could. I mean, the amount that a developer will pay per unit probably gets rolled to a degree into the price of the housing, but it may not get rolled in 100%, right? We've had impact taxes in place for a long time. And it's very likely when developers know that, they also take that into consideration, negotiate the price that they pay for the land. And so you're not 100% sure that if the impact tax is X, that the house cost is whatever, plus they tack X onto it. If the developer got the land cheaper, it may only be a proportion. So it can make housing more expensive, but the most recent changes to the impact taxes really did bring them down to make them 100% of the cost. They had been at 120% of the cost of a seat, and now they're at 100.
Okay, thank you. Kind of another process question. The role of the hearing examiner in planning decisions and the planning recommendation process. Could you kind of explain that? And if other counties have a committee to make decisions, has this been considered for Montgomery County?
Pam, do you want to talk about which cases go to the hearing examiner?
Yeah, I didn't mention it in my slide. So I did mention the local map amendment. So the county council has zoning authority. When somebody wants to change the zoning on their individual piece of property, we call that a local map amendment. And the hearing examiner provides a recommendation to the council for that. And it comes after having a review and recommendation from planning board and planning staff. The other thing the hearing examiner does is the hearing examiner does make a decision on what are called conditional uses. So in a zone, you have uses that are allowed, right? They're all allowed. Some are what are called permitted by right, meaning you can go to DPS and get a building permit for that use or use in occupancy. Others are called limited, which means they are still permitted by right, but there's some what we call limited use standards. There are a few specifications that you have to meet to have that use. You can still go straight to DPS. DPS is going to make sure that you meet those limited use standards and then grant you either your building permit or your use and occupancy permit. But conditional uses are ones that are allowed in the zone, but it recognizes that they can be more intensive or have other unintended consequences compared to the other types of uses. And therefore they get a review by the planning board, who makes a review and recommendation to the hearing examiner. And then the hearing examiner decides. They are the deciding body on a conditional use. So they will say, oh, a daycare in this house on this block what are the effects to the neighbors, because they can take it, they look at it in context. How is this house situated? How close are the neighbors? Is it a cul-de-sac? How many kids do they want in the, in the daycare? So they look at all these specifics and then they can make a decision. I haven't heard anyone talking about having that deciding body become a committee. We've always had it as one hearing examiner who holds a hearing and is, legislatively the decider. So I'm not familiar with the group decision. Now we do have a board of appeals, which are appointed by the county council, but the board of appeals really does hear appeals to decisions made by the hearing examiner. And they also hear appeals for other things in the county code that are appealed.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of conditional use, that was a provision for land use in the recent changes to ag-reserve solar collection permissions. And that provision was criticized by some for being either inefficient or too costly. If it were to be revised, what would the process need to be for that conditional use provision in the ag-reserve to be revised?
Well, there's different ways that you could provide for review of solar projects or anything else you want to build. There are by right projects, and I think Pam has alluded to this. There, for example, if you live in a neighborhood that's zoned for single family houses and you're in an R90 zone, which means one house per 9,000 square feet. If you have a 9,000 square foot lot, you can build a house. Basically, you just go to DPS and ask for a permit. You don't have to go to the planning board. You don't have to go to hearing examiner. You don't have to go to the county council. Just as long as your project matches up what the limitations zoning code are, you don't go through any judicial or discretionary review. And one step up from that would be you have the planning board review a preliminary plan or a site plan, where you would haggle with our staff and you'd go to the planning board and we would review whether or not your application conformed to the code and to the master plan. And there may be some discretionary element to that, but that's pretty much supposed to be based on what do the rules say and does your application meet that. When you're talking about things like a hearing examiner, you're talking about a lot more discretion being involved. And I think the tension is between allowing more detailed review and more input, which most people think sounds good, that people who don't like a project will have their opportunity to weigh in detail, and there's a lot of process associated with that. The downside to that is that it creates a lot of uncertainty if you want to build something. So if you would like to see solar be as easy as possible to build in the ag reserve, one way to do that would be to eliminate as much as possible the discretionary review and just say, okay, here's the rules. Here's where you can build it. Here's where you can't build it. Here's the setback requirements and the screening requirements and the standards that it has to meet. And if it meets it, go ahead. At the other end of the spectrum, people are very reluctant to see, they think that solar could be very disruptive to the integrity of the ag reserve. They'd like to see a lot of process, a lot of review, a lot of judgment exercised by somebody to decide, is this a good project or is this not a good project? Almost by definition, that makes it harder and not so much more expensive in terms of, how much it costs to file an application, but expensive in terms of, having to commit resources to a project, to plan it, to design it, to hire an architect, hire an engineer, line up financing, at the risk of finding out that you can't build it. Because at the end of that process, you don't really know whether or not your project will be approved or not, even if it appears to, on its face, meet the rules that are set out in the code. So that's the kind of tension, and there's not a right or wrong answer about which end of the spectrum is appropriate in a particular case, but I think that's the debate, whether it's solar in the ag reserve or daycare centers in residential neighborhoods or any other type of development project that goes through some kind of discretionary review.
Great, thank you. Our next question, can you explain the rationale behind why promoting growth is better for the county? What would happen if the county did not add more housing or did not see an increase in people moving here, considering that there already is a high demand for housing as it is? What is the thought process behind encouraging more growth at this stage versus backing off of promoting new development?
Well, it's bad for the people who are already here because, I mean, we don't have to guess what that would look like because it's happening. I bought my house for about $500,000 in 2001, and now my house is worth somewhere over $1 million. And I would like to think it's because I'm a shrewd real estate investor, but I think it has more to do with the fact that the supply of housing is constrained and people want to move to this region because we have a dynamic economy. There's opportunity here. And so the result is that housing is more and more unaffordable to more and more people. So that's bad for low-income people. It's also bad for middle-income people and even upper middle-income people. If I had this to do over again, I wouldn't be able to afford to buy my own house in my own neighborhood. So that's a problem for individuals. It's also a problem for the county, as I said, because of that chart I showed about the cost of living in Pittsburgh and North Carolina and Austin, Texas, because the people who are like the CEO of a life sciences company or a tech company who make $400,000 or $500,000 or $600,000 a year are not going to have a problem finding a place to live that's satisfactory to them. It's the people who are lab techs or people who are, entry or even mid-level software engineers, people who have choices about where to take a job, where they want to live. And if they feel like they're on the hamster wheel, just trying to keep up with the cost of living, and then they get a call from, for an opportunity for a job in Pittsburgh or Raleigh, North Carolina or Austin, Texas, that's going to start looking pretty good. So it's a question of our ability to support a high quality of life and support jobs and the tax base. And it's also a question of the hardship that it imposes on individuals, not just poor people, but even middle or upper middle income people who struggle to find a place to live that serves their needs. Obviously, most middle income people, upper middle income people can put a roof over their head, but they may find they're commuting 20, 30, 40 miles a day each way in heavy traffic to and from work because they can't live anywhere near where their jobs are. Or they may find that they can't live near the kinds of recreational amenities or schools or other services that they're looking for. So if we constrain housing supply and don't allow housing supply to expand at a rate that is reasonably aligned with the rather slow population growth and job growth that we have, at least, it's bad for individuals and it's also bad for our community.
Great, thank you. So how does our next question is, how does a zoning text amendment, which can change over a third of the county zoning, fit into a more longer term master plans, sector plans, or historical preservation plans? Should a newer ZTA at this moment wait until perhaps the Thrive 2050 plan is thoroughly vetted by the public or by the council?
Well, the ZTA on missing middle will be after Thrive is through the council. So I guess that's the short answer. Pam, do you want to address?
Yeah, and the other thing, I think maybe that someone misread the ZTA, because I think it was limited to a mile around our metro stations. So I don't think that would affect a third of the county. If it were all of our 60 zoning, then that might be the case. But I think given that it's limited to a mile around the metro stations, nonetheless, Commissioner Anderson's right. It's going to wait until Thrive 2050 comes to the council and things are taken up more holistically.
Great, thank you very much. We are quickly coming up to the end of our time. I think we can probably get in one more question. And oh, wow, I gotta be honest, there's a lot of questions here. Okay, so how about we'll end on this one. How does the planning committee propose ways to encourage perhaps more artistic endeavors and more artistic expression avenues in the county, whether or not it's for private use or in public spaces such as parks? And how do they encourage that while also ensuring that there are, affordable places for people who work in creative industries to live in the county or at least close by?
Well, affordable housing in general, and not just regulated affordable housing, but as we've been talking about, a broader range of housing of different types, smaller units, diversity of housing could include live work to some extent, housing types that are designed to accommodate, putting your business, including your art studio, in the same place that you live is one approach. And there's a project like that in downtown Silver Spring that's getting built right now. But I think that the other part of it is that we incorporate public art into many of our development projects. It's a requirement in some cases for especially developments in central business districts like Silver Spring and Bethesda and Germantown, that large projects are often asked to include public art as part of the development review process. So that actually creates a market for art. And we're running a process right now, a competition where we've commissioned a mural for the side of the building where I'm sitting right now, our new headquarters in Wheaton. So we look for ways to not just encourage, but in many cases require art that's financed with public resources as well as money from private developers.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think that about wraps up our Q&A portion for the night. So I'm going to turn it back to Lynna.
Thank you very much, Casey and Pam, for your informative presentations and responses. And thank you, Amelia, for going through these questions. I wish we could have gotten to more of them because they were really excellent. And I want to also thank all of you that attended tonight. If you enjoyed this program, please consider supporting the League's work. We invite you to visit our webpage at LWVMOCOMD.org, LWVMOCOMD Maryland, where you can find links to join or donate. We wish you all good evening and hope to see you in another one of our events. Good night.